Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for December 10th, 2021. And a month ago, I think today, I reported on efforts in states to get the ball rolling against OSHA mandates. And on this episode, I've got a follow-up. We now have bills pre-filed in 4 states that can help set the foundation to nullify these mandates in practice and effect. I'm going to give you an overview of each. I'm going to point out some flaws in 3 of them, and then one critical strategy error to watch out for that could make sure that these mandates are around forever. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow the show, all the archives for 3.5 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I'm going to link to the stuff that I'm talking about so you can click in and read and learn more on your own time. I've also got a couple of other episodes for you to check out as well, with important foundational information that relates to what I'm talking about today. You can find all the different platforms we're on, the video platforms, the audio-only podcast edition, and you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's easy peasy, all spelled out. It's long, but 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I want to start it out, first of all, with this episode from last month. Yes, and it was November 10th. First steps to nullify OSHA mandates in 2 states. In that episode, I covered some essential strategy that really is the basis for what I'm reporting on today. So you should check this one out if you haven't. We've got James Madison's advice in Federalist 46 on how to defeat federal programs without relying on the federal government to magically limit itself. And that focuses heavily on Madison's advice of a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union for individuals, cities, and states, plus a little insight on OSHA's Achilles heel, their lack of enforcement capability, which I'll briefly repeat a little bit later. Today, I reported on a bill in Florida, which is now passed, that starts the process of the state taking over the occupational safety enforcement from OSHA, from the feds in Florida. And then a New Hampshire bill request that was filed to actually ban the state from helping the feds enforce these mandates. So today, let's start there with New Hampshire. And the bill is House Bill 1455, introduced by Speaker of the House Packard. When it's introduced by the Speaker of the House, you know this is going to be a priority piece of legislation for the session. It's possible that it won't go anywhere. Maybe someone will get to him. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean he's a good guy, but there's a lot of grassroots support for doing this. Speaker Packard, along with 5 co-sponsors, House Bill 1455 would prohibit, quote, state enforcement of any federal law, order, or rule that requires an individual as a condition of employment or any other activity to provide proof of vaccination against COVID-19 or to submit more than once per month to COVID testing. The prohibited activities under the proposed law include these, but are not limited to these 3. Investigating the violation of or imposing a penalty. B, providing any assistance to any federal department or agency in investigating or penalizing either through personnel activity or through the use of any state or local government property. And then C, providing vaccination status of any named individual to any federal department or agency, or engaging in any communication with any federal department or agency regarding any investigation into a violation. This is a huge first step should it pass in New Hampshire, House Bill 1455. Now, here's the Achilles heel. OSHA only employs 774 inspectors for the entire country. Approximately 1,200 more work for the states but enforce OSHA rules. And they have to somehow be in charge of doing inspections, if needed, for more than 7 million businesses. OSHA has said this for years. It would take them approximately 160 years on a combination of federal and state inspectors to inspect every business under its jurisdiction just one time. And here from the report, that's why the feds will have to rely on snitches to have any snitches and, of course, mass compliance. Compliance is violence, I guess, in this situation. That's why the feds will have to rely on snitches to have any hope of enforcing this mandate. They say here, a former OSHA chief of staff said there is no army of OSHA inspectors that's going to be knocking on employers' doors or even calling them. They're going to rely on workers and their union reps to file complaints. I mean, of course, that's what we're expecting. But OSHA is also saying that it's, quote, a team effort. They're going to rely heavily on state cooperation. They want to do what so many other federal agencies do, rely on the states to provide resources, logistics, and information sharing in order to be able to pull that kind of stuff off. The dirty little secret they don't want any of us to know is that partnerships and team efforts don't work when half the team quits. House Bill 1455 in New Hampshire is the best of the bunch that we've seen filed so far. It's been sent over to the House Committee on Health, Human Services, and Elderly Affairs. It will get hearings there, probably at least 2, and then a vote. We are urging people who live in New Hampshire, not out of the state. If you start calling from out of the state, this is a guaranteed way to get the bill killed. But so I guess we're giving opposition some ammo, though. So people in New Hampshire are strongly urged to contact all the members of the committee and urge them to vote yes, which is really in New Hampshire, it's ought to pass on House Bill 1455. And then they should call their own state representative and ask them to co-sponsor House Bill 1455. I will link to that report in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty. And if you scroll to the bottom, you get those action steps as well. Next up, we have Oklahoma. Representative Jim Olson pre-filed House Bill 2981. The session doesn't start until early February, but the legislation declares that, quote, forcing a vaccination mandate as a condition of employment against or upon a citizen of Oklahoma, which would infringe upon a citizen's constitutionally protected rights, shall be null, void, and unenforceable, and of no effect in the state of Oklahoma. Sounds good. It also creates a cause. I'll get to the problems with this bill. It has a good foundation where they're saying, look, the state is going to consider this null and void, but there's no mechanism to make it that way. Just merely saying it doesn't actually make it that way in practice. The feds are going to look at that and be like, okay, nice opinion. We're coming in and doing enforcement when we can. House Bill 2981 would also create, this is an interesting thing, a cause of action in state court for Oklahoma workers to sue employers if they are forced to get a vaccine as a condition of employment and suffer adverse effects. So it's creating, I guess, something to make employees think about the risks associated with working with the feds to enforce these things. Which one's going to be the greater risk? I'm not really sure. We're not sure how this is going to play out. But here's the issue here. Language calling the mandates, and this is a report by Mike Meharry, language calling the mandates null, void, and unenforceable. That's great. It sets a foundation for further action, but it does not end state or local enforcement of these federal mandates. It does not tell the state officers to stop helping the federal government, which happens on everything. Most federal programs we know today are enforced through a partnership between the feds and the states because the feds are doing so much stuff outside of the Constitution. They don't have the person power, even though it's the largest government in the history of the world. They still don't have the person power to pull it off. The bill, Mike writes, does not specifically prohibit state or local enforcement of anything. And in order to make it that way, null and void in practice and effect, the first step that has to happen in Oklahoma is they need to amend this legislation that's been pre-filed. It's very early. So the first committee hearing, the sponsor, Jim Olson, if you live in Oklahoma, ask him to watch the show or read this report and send him the information. House Bill 2981 should get a small amendment. And Mike puts it this way, amending House Bill 2981 with a provision that specifically bans the use of state personnel and resources from enforcing a mandate would take the first step towards nullifying such mandates in practice and effect. And of course, we just recommend following the model that we saw introduced by Speaker Packard in New Hampshire. That's really the approach to get the ball rolling. Now, this is not going to be easy to get done, but these are the first steps that need to happen. Next up is South Carolina. There's a whole bunch of people that signed on to sponsor this bill. House Bill 3126, it declares unlawful federal mask mandates and unlawful federal vaccine mandates are, quote, invalid in this state, may not be recognized in this state, and are null, void, and of no effect in the state. So that's also they're declaring that they're null and void. They call them illegal. They give the definitions of what that means in the bill, which you can read about on your own time. But it prohibits the state or any of the state political subdivisions, these are local governments, for example, from accepting any federal funds to enforce these mask or vaccine mandates. And we think that's pretty good as a start, saying we're going to turn down the loot. You have to actually start cutting down this kind of federal bribery approach on basically everything. We also then have to deal with the fact that the feds are stealing it in the first place, but that's probably going to be later on down the road. But rejecting funds to help out the feds on this stuff is a good first step. But in order to actually make it null, void, and of no effect in the state also needs to expressly prohibit enforcement, just like in New Hampshire, the legislation in New Hampshire. And Meharry put it this way in his report that we published, I guess, Wednesday. Amending the bill with language withdrawing the state from enforcing OSHA regulations and explicitly or expressly prohibiting state or local government agencies and their employees from enforcing the mandates or even participating in that enforcement would take a significant step towards making such mandates null and void in practice and effect. And he specifically links to the New Hampshire bill. He says a bill introduced in New Hampshire provides a good example of such language. And then last up today is Alabama. Very similar situation in Alabama from Representative James Hines. House Bill 29 was introduced with 5 co-sponsors, at least at this point. The legislation declares this state shall not recognize or observe any federal vaccine mandate implemented after January 1st, 2020. And I shared this on Twitter, and I got to go back and read the bill, but they like the idea, and I think this is really interesting as well, that they don't specifically name what type of mandate or what type of vaccine. They just say, if it's a federal mandate, we're not going to recognize it. They want to make it null and void as well. It creates a cause of action in state court as well for Alabama employees to sue employers for, quote, any damages caused by an adverse reaction, injury, or temporary or permanent disability arising from an employer mandate that he or she receive a vaccination for COVID-19. Now, this is interesting. I'm not doing an episode today on a federal vaccine court, for example, but this is an interesting end run. How that would play out in practice in court is another question. We're not sure. This is a first attempt at this type of thing, but I do think it's interesting strategy. And again, Meharry covers in this report, he says, amending HB 29. This is essential. These 3 states are missing this. If you just say something is null and void, it's a nice start, but if you pass it like that, that's all you end up passing, and then you create this kind of process for courts, then what you're doing is doing a little bit more, just a little bit more than a non-binding resolution, which can be good if that's what you're describing it as. But if you really want to make this stuff null and void in practice, you have to ban the enforcement expressly. And he says, amending HB 29 with a provision that specifically bans the use of state personnel and resources from enforcing a mandate would take the first step towards nullifying such mandates in practice and effect. You're going to hear us say the same thing over and over and over. Now, a lot of people have been telling me, yeah, Bolden, these are pretty good ideas, but things are going pretty good in the courts, and we should wait out for the courts. And we've heard this many times over the years on various issues, primarily from the right. Just wait for the courts. We're going to get this done. Things are going well. But honestly, that is a terrible, terrible strategy. It's an excuse to not take a stand, to not do the resistance that the founders and old revolutionaries wanted us to do when government usurps power. And if you think about it, just this week, another federal court also took the position that warrantless surveillance by the NSA under Section 702 of Americans is totally constitutional. Now, that we could wait for that as well, and maybe it's going to go well, and maybe it's not. In the long run, I think if we zoom out and look at the big picture, the Supreme Court is much more likely to act like a rubber stamp for the federal government, for federal power, than to act like a roadblock to its expansion. We've been warned about this for a long, long time. I covered this in an episode last month as well. Resistance should be the first response, not the last. Resist first, said Mercy Otis Warren, the muse of the American Revolution. A nullification of the act is the rightful remedy when the federal government goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, said Thomas Jefferson. One of the first Supreme Court justices, James Iredell said the people should resist when the government exercises or usurps powers that were not delegated to it. I will link to that episode in the show notes. It's essential for us to start taking this approach. If we don't, we are absolutely doomed. And in another episode I did over the summer, this is one that I think is really, really important. It's titled Ignoring the Founders Ensures the ACA is Here to Stay. In that episode, I pointed out how using this approach of let's see how things go in the courts, let's see how things go in the midterms, and then the next 4 years, and then the next round in the courts, wait for this, wait for that, but never resist, never nullify, never take a stand, never draw a line in the sand, wait for the federal government to get the right people in there that will limit the powers of the federal government, is why we still have Obamacare. Most of it is still on the books today. It should have been nullified into oblivion a long time ago. I will, of course, link to that episode in the show notes as well. Well, this was a quick take on this stuff. I will link to all these things, these extra episodes as well, in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. If you support the show, nothing helps us roll up our sleeves every single day and get this kind of information out to people more than the financial faith and support of our members. $2 a month is where that starts over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us out by smashing a like button, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, leave comments or subscribe, get notifications on all these different platforms. That triggers algorithms and tells them to show the program to more people, and I can't thank you enough for your help. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you're encouraged to take action in your own state, whether it's one of these that I've covered or something where a bill has not been filed yet. These are some steps that you can follow. I would follow the New Hampshire approach. And then, of course, we have to keep in mind that no matter what you pass on a state level, if people don't actively resist it, it doesn't matter. There's nothing to enforce. So it doesn't matter whether the states help out or not. So really, the resist first is the most important message of all. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you have a great weekend coming up, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.